until they are nullified.
¿Y qué hace Henry Thoreau? No es solo un intelectual, es un hombre práctico.
And what did Thoreau do? He was not just an intellectual, an academic. He was a very pragmatic, a very practical person.
Decía, como a Gandhi, que era un idealista práctico.
Like Gandhi, he said he was a practical idealist.
Y se niega a pagar los impuestos para la guerra contra México, porque decía, eso es injusto y es inmoral.
And Thoreau refused to pay his taxes, that portion of his taxes that he said would be used to support the war against Mexico. Why? Because he said that war was totally unjust. I can't support it.
Ahora, cuando tratamos de ver lo que es la violencia, hay una violencia que es social y otra violencia que es estructural. ¿Qué diferencias hay entre la violencia social y la violencia estructural?
If we look at violence, we could say that there are different forms, different kinds of violence. There is social violence and there is structural violence. What's the difference between these? What kinds of, what different consequences do they have?
No hay pobres porque quieren. Hay pobres por las desigualdades sociales, políticas, económicas.
You know, there aren't poor people because people want to be poor. There are poor people because there is social injustice, because there is economic inequality. There are reasons for poverty.
Y estas desigualdades económicas y políticas generan la pobreza, generan el hambre. El informe de la FAO habla de, por día mueren en el mundo más de 35.000 niños de hambre.
These economic injustices, this economic inequality is what brings about poverty, what provokes hunger. You know, the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, says that each and every day, 35,000 children die of hunger.
Hay una desigualdad muy grande de países ricos con los países pobres.
There is a huge inequality between countries that are richer and countries that have been impoverished.
Hay un problema que es estructural en nuestras sociedades y por eso es necesario trabajar para cambiar esa violencia estructural.
And this is part of the structural violence that exists in our societies. And that's why it's important for us to work to overcome, to transform these structures of violence.
Está la violencia social, que es la discriminación, la marginalidad, la falta de educación, la falta de salud. ¿Cómo cambiamos esto? ¿Es posible cambiar esto?
There are also different forms of social violence. Violence that we see in discrimination, in marginalization, in the lack of access to education or of health care. Is it possible to really change this kind of social violence? We have to ask ourselves.
No basta dar limosna al más necesitado. Hay que darle condiciones de vida, de dignidad, de ser persona.
It's not enough, in a sense, to give alms to the poor. We have to be about the task of ensuring dignified conditions of life for all people everywhere, so that people can live decently.
Así nos encontramos en muchas partes del mundo, países ricos empobrecidos. Nosotros no somos países pobres, somos países riquísimos, pero empobrecidos.
And this is why we see, if we look around the world, that there are rich countries that have become poor. And this is no accident. They're indeed processes of making poverty, of making whole countries, turning what are wealthy countries, countries that are rich in many ways, into impoverished countries.
Pensamos cuánto se gasta por día en armamentos para proyectos de muertes y no para la vida, ¿qué sociedad estamos construyendo?
If we think about how much money is spent each day on arms, for instance, money spent for death, for destruction, and not for life.
El siglo XX también nos ha presentado grandes desafíos, como los avances tecnológicos. La tecnología nos cambió la vida, nos cambió el pensamiento.
If we think about the 20th century, we can also see that it brings lots of challenges, brought lots of challenges for us. The technological revolution. Technology has changed our lives in very important ways over the past years.
Y lo que les voy a decir, piénsenlo, lo pueden desarrollar, yo simplemente lo voy a señalar.
And I want to just mention something now. I'm not going to go into it in great depth. You can develop the idea yourselves.
Las tecnologías nos ha llevado a la aceleración del tiempo.
But in a sense, if we think about technology, we could say that it has really, in a sense, taken us to a point where time is kind of accelerated.
Esta aceleración del tiempo nos lleva a casi a no pensar, porque una noticia es superada por otra, a los 2-3 minutos ya es una noticia vieja.
And this acceleration of, everything that goes on around us, in a sense, has brought us to a point really where it's very hard to think. If you think about the news and we say, okay, there's a news and I want to reflect about it, does it mean, where is it taking us? And 2 or 3 minutes later, there's another news, and we're on to something else, and we don't have that time that we need to reflect on it.
Y esas tecnologías en la aceleración del tiempo va imponiendo condicionamientos a la humanidad, como el pensamiento único.
And this technological acceleration of time, in a sense, means that there really is, we see that there's, in a sense, a way of thinking that is kind of imposed on us and on all of society, a very uniform way of thinking about the world and what are the problems of the world.
Y ustedes saben que hoy tecnológicamente se desarrollan lo que son los monocultivos de soja, los monocultivos de árboles. Hoy hablaba con los jóvenes en una comunicación que hicimos por Skype, que también es un avance tecnológico.
If we think about this technology, it also is something that has brought about, for instance, the monocultures. We could think about the huge monocultural expansion of whether it's soybeans or trees, whatever. This morning we were conversing with some young people about this reality, and kind of a virtual conversation by Skype or using new technologies.
Y hay cosas que son asombrosas, presten atención. En los monocultivos no hay pájaros, no hay biodiversidad. ¿Qué pasa?
And there's something that, want to comment is something that's really amazing. But if you go to, and if you're in the midst of a monoculture, or whatever, whether it's trees, soybeans, what have you, you won't hear any birds. There aren't any birds.
¿Qué pasa? Que no nos encontramos con sapos, pájaros, ardillas.
We don't find any frogs, there aren't any birds, there aren't any squirrels.
Y hoy hablábamos con los jóvenes sobre el problema del agua. Mañana es el Día Internacional del Agua.
And this morning we were talking with young people about water. Tomorrow is World Water Day.
Y el agua es un bien de la humanidad, no es un recurso más, es un bien de la humanidad y debiera estar en la Declaración Universal de los Derechos Humanos.
We were talking a lot about water. Water, is not just another resource. Water is really a universal good. It is something it should be in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Ahora, si nosotros destruimos la relación del ser humano con la madre naturaleza, estamos provocando violencia social y estructural.
And if we as human beings go about and continue the process, in a sense, of destroying Mother Earth, then we have to see that that also is a form of violence. And we have to see how we can end it.
Y tenemos que estar pensando el mundo que vivimos, porque la violencia tiene muchos rostros.
We have to think about the world in which we live and recognize that violence has many, many different faces.
Y cambiar esto tiene que ver también con la educación, con la toma de conciencia crítica, con valores del ser humano en relación con la madre tierra, que nosotros en América Latina le llamamos Pachamama, nuestra Pachamama.
And if we want to transform, in a sense, this kind of violence that we find in our world, we see that this is a task it's an educational task. It's a task that has to do with building critical consciousness and a real awareness of what's happening in our world. It's a task that has to do with building values and strengthening those values, values of living in harmony with Mother Earth. You know, in Latin America, we call Mother Earth the Pachamama.
Y creo que desde ahí es un desafío a qué hacer para cambiar esto.
And I think this is a huge challenge. It's a tremendous challenge for all of us to think, you know, what can we do to be about the business of changing this kind of violence?
Porque en muchos países hablan de democracia. Aquí en Estados Unidos hablan de democracia. ¿Pero qué significa la democracia?
Because in lots of places, for instance, lots of people, lots of governments talk about democracy. Here in the US, for instance, we talk a lot about democracy, and the US government talks a lot about democracy, but what kind of democracy?
Pensamos
What do we understand?
Pensamos que la democracia es poner el voto en una urna cada 4 años, cada 6 años, y decir que vivimos en democracia. Esto no es cierto.
Is democracy, I mean, does that just mean, you know, we go every 4 years and we put our ballot in the ballot box, you know, we vote and we participate in democracy? Is that what democracy is really all about? I don't think so. I don't think that's really democracy.
Democracia significa derecho e igualdad para todos y todas.
I think democracy means rights and equality for all people.
Si no logramos esto, estamos en un camino, por ahí caminos equivocados, pero tenemos que reencauzar el camino hacia la convivencia, hacia el respeto que nos merecemos unos a otros.
And I think that this is, in a sense, the direction that we need to be traveling. We need to be working for rights and equality for all people. And if this is not the direction in which we're going, then we need to see how we can change it. We need to transform, in a sense, to be sure that we are really headed in a way that is working toward and building the possibility of dignity for all people and respect for the rights of all people everywhere.
Lo que pasó en el siglo XX tenemos que pensarlo para el siglo XXI. No podemos seguir en la misma situación.
If we think about the 20th century, we need to really focus, in a sense, on the idea that we can't allow the 21st century to repeat what happened in the last century.
Por eso insisto mucho que tenemos que volver a pensar en un nuevo contrato social. Así como Juan Jacobo Rousseau en su momento plantea el contrato social que da nacimiento a las democracias, a la convivencia. Hoy el desafío es pensar en un nuevo contrato social.
And that's why I often insist on the idea that we really need to be about the process of building a new social contract. You know, if we think about Rousseau, John Jacob Rousseau, in centuries past, and the idea of a social contract that has given rise to the kind of democratic governments that we know today, we really need to think about building a new social contract.
No podemos seguir golpeándonos el pecho y decir, pobres los pobres.
We can't just, in a sense, continue to beat our breasts and say, oh, how poor those poor people are.
Tenemos que preguntarnos por qué hay pobres.
We have to ask, why are there so many poor people?
José de Castro, ese gran pensador brasileño que fue director de la FAO, la Organización Mundial para la Alimentación.
If we think about José de Castro, a Brazilian, the great intellectual thinker, who was the first director of the Food and Agricultural Organization,
Decía que el hambre es la manifestación biológica de una enfermedad sociológica.
and he always said that hunger is the biological manifestation of a sociological problem.
¿Cómo podemos cambiar estas relaciones? Porque hablamos de la violencia social y estructural, pero es posible cambiar esto. Es posible encontrar otros caminos y alternativas para la humanidad.
We have to ask ourselves, really, is it possible to overcome these kinds of violence? Is it possible to transform problems like the problem of hunger? We look at social violence and see the structural violence that exists in our societies, and we really have to ask ourselves, what steps can be taken? What's the way in which we can work to transform, to build another world, to overcome these kinds of violence?
Tenemos que trabajar también para cambiar estructuras que en un momento fueron útiles, pero que hoy son inútiles.
We have to work, among other things, maybe to change structures that perhaps at one time were useful, but are no longer useful for our societies.
Y que necesita de una reforma profunda como las Naciones Unidas.
Structures that need to be very profoundly changed and transformed. Structures, for instance, like the United Nations.
Estas grandes organizaciones de las naciones que hoy están paralizadas porque no pueden ni detener las guerras.
These structures that bring together nations from all over the world, like the UN, but they are really paralyzed in many of their objectives. They're not effective, for instance, in bringing about an end to war.
Mientras no cambiemos esas estructuras, las mejoremos. Es decir, tratar de darle más contenidos democráticos, porque hoy no son estructuras democráticas.
If we are not able to transform these kinds of structures, to really make them become more democratic, because they're not democratic structures. They're not today representative of the world's peoples. If we can't do this, then we won't be able to really turn them into structures that are useful today.
Hoy les decía un periodista que Naciones Unidas, cuando se crea en el año 45, después de la guerra, la última guerra mundial, eran 57 estados. Hoy son 193 estados y sigue la misma estructura del año 45.
I was saying this afternoon to a journalist, if we think about the UN that was created in 1945 at the end of the last World War, there were 57 states that formed the United Nations. But today there are 193 states that are members of that organization, a huge difference. But the structures of the United Nations have not changed at all. They're the same structures today as they were in 1945.
Podríamos hablar de otras organizaciones internacionales, pero no los quiero fatigar nombrando cada una, porque no terminaríamos más de señalar esas falencias.
We could mention all kinds of other international organizations that in a sense suffer the same problem, but I don't want to tire you with the details. The list would be very, very long.
Y la forma de cambiar es esto, que los pueblos se asuman como protagonistas de su propia vida y de su propia historia, que dejen la pasividad.
And how can we go about changing these structures? This is a question for all peoples everywhere. We can change these structures of violence when people assume their role as protagonists of their own lives, of their own histories, their own futures.
La soberanía alimentaria no va a ser por las grandes empresas de los monocultivos, van a ser a partir del pequeño y mediano productor rural. Ahí es donde se va a fortalecer la soberanía alimentaria, en la diversidad, no en la uniformidad.
If we think about food sovereignty, for instance, it's not the big agribusiness multinationals that are going to bring about food sovereignty. It is the small and medium-sized farmers, peasants around the world who are going to strengthen and make it possible for there to be food sovereignty out of their diversity and not out of the uniformity that the big multinationals would want us to believe, that food sovereignty can be strengthened.
Porque lo más grave que nos está pasando es que nos están imponiendo, atiendan esto, al monocultivo de las mentes.
And really the worst thing that's happening to us, and pay attention here, you could say that the worst kind of thing that's happening to us is that we are, in a sense,